It was almost midnight on July the 28th, 2021, when blue and red lights washed over a stretch of Eastern Boulevard in Essex, a community just outside Baltimore. The streets were quiet, the night heavy with the sticky air of midsummer. An officer from Baltimore County Police noticed a car traveling too fast. A simple traffic stop, that's all it was supposed to be. But in the space of minutes, a small violation would unravel into one of the most horrifying discoveries the county had ever seen. The time was recorded as 11:17 p.m. The vehicle came to a stop near Wagner's Lane. The officer approached with the routine questions. License? Registration? Insurance? The driver, a 33-year-old woman named Nicole Johnson, had none of these. She admitted she didn't have a valid license. The registration was missing. The car displayed a temporary tag, but it wasn't real. By itself, that meant the car would be towed. A nuisance for the driver, an inconvenience for the officer, but nothing extraordinary. That was before the officer noticed something that made his stomach turn. As he leaned closer, a smell rose in the night air. A smell no one forgets once they've encountered it. The charging documents later recorded the officer's words, the unmistakable odor of decomposition. It was strong, sharp, and unnatural, the kind of smell that speaks of death long before the eyes see it. Then his eyes caught movement maggots crawling in a bag in the trunk space. The officer straightened, his instincts telling him this was no ordinary stop. He told Nicole the car would be impounded, instructed her to gather her personal items. She moved to comply, lifting bags and blankets from the car. That was when horror revealed itself. She pulled back a blanket, and the outline of a small body became visible. The officer froze for a moment. A child. He radioed urgently, his voice steady but edged with shock. Backup was called. As more officers arrived, the search continued. Another bag was opened. Inside was a second child. The quiet road had transformed into a crime scene, a place where innocence ended and tragedy stood exposed under street lamps and flashing sirens. The children were later identified as 7-year-old Joshlyn Marie James Johnson and her 5-year-old brother, Larry Darnell O'Neill III. They were siblings, bonded not just by blood, but by the innocence of childhood. Neighbors and family would later say they were sweet children, with small dreams and bright smiles, whose young lives should have been filled with laughter and play. Instead, their final moments had been marked by neglect and violence, their small bodies hidden away as if their lives meant nothing. That night, officers tried to piece together what had just been discovered. Who were these children? How had they ended up here? Why were they with this woman, Nicole Johnson, who now stood on the roadside as the weight of her secrets pressed down? Reports later noted that when the bodies were uncovered, Nicole attempted to flee on foot. She did not get far. She was apprehended and placed under arrest. In the days that followed, the children's names were released. Joshlyn, only 7 years old, weighed just 18 pounds at the time of her death. Larry, 5 years old, weighed 21. Doctors who examined them said this level of malnourishment did not happen overnight. It took months, perhaps even longer. Malnutrition leaves visible traces: the thin frame, the frailness of movement, the hollow look in the eyes. Someone might have noticed. Someone could have raised a concern, but no one did, or if they did, the warning was not enough to change the outcome. The story of how the children came to be in Nicole Johnson's care began years earlier. Their mother, Nicole Johnson, lived in Ohio before moving to Maryland in July 2019. She had trusted Nicole, her sister, to help with the children for a time. Life had not been easy for her, and like many struggling mothers, she leaned on family. Nicole became the caregiver. For Joshlyn, the expectation was that this arrangement was temporary. She would get back on her feet and then bring her children home. At some point, she tried. Reports and court coverage later revealed that she attempted to regain custody. For reasons that remain tangled in family complications, it never happened. That missed chance is one of the shadows hanging over this case. Investigators pressed Nicole for answers after the discovery. What had happened to Joshlyn and Larry? According to the charging documents, Nicole gave an explanation that was as disturbing as it was tragic. She told police that in May 2020, more than a year before the traffic stop, Joshlyn had been misbehaving. Nicole admitted to striking her. The little girl fell, hit her head on the floor, and never woke up. Nicole said she placed Joshlyn's body in a suitcase, keeping it hidden. The horror did not end there. In May 2021, Nicole said she found blood on Larry's leg while he was asleep. She claimed that he, too, never woke up. She then placed his body in a tote bag alongside his sister. These admissions, written in court papers, were chilling. They spoke of two young lives lost a year apart, their small bodies stored away, carried from place to place as if they were luggage rather than children. As investigators listened to Nicole's story, the timeline of suffering began to unfold. For more than a year, she had driven around with the remains of Joshlyn in her possession. For months after, she had carried Larry as well. The smell that officers noticed on that July night was not sudden, it was the lingering presence of lives taken too soon. The maggots, the decomposition, the terrible odor were the natural result of a secret kept far too long. The deeper the investigation went, the more horrifying the details became. Medical examiners confirmed the malnourished state of both children. 18 pounds for a 7-year-old. 21 pounds for a 5-year-old. Children that age should have been twice that weight. They should have been healthy, laughing, eating snacks, running in playgrounds. Instead, their condition told a story of neglect and slow starvation. Doctors were clear, this did not happen overnight. It took months of deprivation. It meant that anyone who saw them in those months might have recognized the signs. Thin arms, visible ribs, lethargy. It was all there. But no one stepped in with enough force to save them. Nicole's arrest came swiftly after the traffic stop. She was charged with multiple counts, including first-degree child abuse resulting in death. The case shocked Maryland, and soon it spread across national headlines. People could not believe the details. An aunt, entrusted with care, driving with the remains of 2 children in her trunk, discovered only because of a routine speeding stop. It was almost too awful to comprehend. As the legal process began, Nicole sat in custody, awaiting trial. But as months turned into years, the case did not move to a jury. In August 2024, more than 3 years after the discovery, Nicole stood in a Baltimore County courtroom and pleaded guilty. She admitted responsibility for both deaths. 2 counts of first-degree child abuse resulting in death. There would be no lengthy trial, no cross-examination of witnesses, no jury deliberation. Instead, the judge would hear arguments, weigh sentencing, and deliver a decision. On February 10, 2025, the courtroom was filled with a heavy silence as Judge Nancy M. Purpura announced the sentence. Nicole Michelle Johnson was given life in prison, with all but 50 years suspended. 50 years behind bars, a measure of justice for Joshlyn and Larry. Reporters noted that Nicole held her head in her hands as the words were spoken. Her fate was sealed, but the greater loss was already beyond repair. 2 children were gone, their lives stolen before they had a chance to grow. For the community, for the family, the questions remain. How could this have happened? Why did no one intervene sooner? Doctors said the children's bodies showed months of malnutrition. That means the signs were visible. Perhaps neighbors saw. Perhaps store clerks noticed. Perhaps teachers or relatives knew something was wrong. But in the end, the children stayed where they were, trapped in a life of neglect that ended in tragedy. Today, the names of Joshlyn and Larry live on as a reminder. They remind us of the importance of paying attention, of speaking out when children seem unwell, of never assuming someone else will act. Their story is heartbreaking, their ending cruel, but in telling it, we honor their short lives. We say their names so they are not forgotten, so that maybe, in remembering them, another child might be saved. The story of Nicole Johnson did not begin on that July night in 2021. To understand how things came to such a terrible point, investigators and reporters looked back at who she was, where she came from, and how she ended up with the responsibility of 2 young children who would never make it past the ages of 7 and 5. Nicole Michelle Johnson was 33 when the traffic stop changed her life forever. She had grown up in Maryland, living in Baltimore, and later in the suburbs of Essex. Those who knew her described her life as unsettled, sometimes chaotic, and often weighed down by financial and personal troubles. Like many people who struggle to keep steady jobs, steady housing, and steady relationships, Nicole found herself moving from place to place, never quite building the stability that children desperately need. Her sister, Nicole Johnson, was raising Joshlyn and Larry, but was also facing her own hardships. By 2019, she had relocated from Ohio to Maryland, and during this time, she leaned on her sister to care for the children temporarily. Family members sometimes step into roles like this when life becomes heavy for a parent. But what began as a temporary arrangement became something much darker when the children were never returned to their mother. At one point, Nicole tried to regain custody, but for reasons that remain tangled in family difficulties and perhaps bureaucratic obstacles, it never happened. The children stayed with Nicole, and in that home, life was far from nurturing. Investigators later pieced together the children's final years through Nicole's own statements, through autopsy results, and through the evidence of what was found in the trunk of her car. What they learned was devastating. According to the charging documents, Nicole said that in May 2020, she struck Joshlyn during an episode of discipline. The child fell, struck her head, and died. Instead of calling 911, instead of reaching out for help, instead of giving her niece the dignity of a proper burial, Nicole placed her in a suitcase and kept her hidden. For more than a year, Joshlyn's body was carried from place to place, the suitcase becoming a silent witness to a crime that no one yet knew had been committed. 1 year later, in May 2021, Nicole said she discovered blood on little Larry's leg while he slept. She said he never woke up. Once again, she chose concealment over truth. She placed his body in a plastic tote, and there, the 5-year-old remained alongside his sister. For months, Nicole lived with both children's remains in her possession. She carried them as if they were cargo, stowing them in her car, transporting them in the trunk, hiding them under blankets. That summer night in Essex, when the officer pulled her over, the long-kept secret could no longer be hidden. Medical examiners later confirmed what Nicole's words could not fully convey. Both children were extremely underweight. At 7 years old, Joshlyn weighed only 18 pounds, the weight of a toddler. Larry, at 5, weighed 21 pounds. These were not just numbers on a page, they were evidence of prolonged neglect. A child does not reach that level of malnourishment in days or weeks. It takes months, perhaps years, of being deprived of adequate nutrition. Experts said the children's bodies showed signs of severe neglect. Their growth had been stunted, their energy drained, their very survival eroded over time. When those details were revealed to the public, outrage spread quickly. People could not understand how 2 children could waste away like that without intervention. Where were the neighbors? Where were the relatives? Where were the systems designed to protect the vulnerable? These questions became louder in the weeks and months after the discovery. It was not just about one aunt who had failed, it was about an entire web of missed chances to save 2 young lives. As the case moved through the courts, Nicole remained in custody. She faced the possibility of a trial, where prosecutors would lay out the evidence, where witnesses would testify, and where jurors would hear the grim details of what had happened. But in August 2024, after 3 long years of waiting, Nicole stood before a judge and admitted guilt. She pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree child abuse resulting in death. This plea meant that there would be no jury trial, no public cross-examination of witnesses, no defense strategy trying to cast doubt on the prosecution's case. It meant she accepted responsibility for what she had done, or at least for the charges the state pursued. That courtroom moment in August 2024 was significant. The plea spared the children's family from having to endure a trial filled with graphic testimony and photographs. It spared the community from months of reliving the gruesome details. But it also meant that the chance to hear every piece of evidence in open court was gone. The truth, as far as the public knew, was what had been recorded in charging documents, autopsy reports, and Nicole's own statements. The sentencing came in February 2025. On the 10th of that month, Judge Nancy M. Purpura delivered the final decision. Nicole Michelle Johnson was sentenced to life in prison, with all but 50 years suspended. In effect, she would serve 50 years behind bars. For a woman in her mid-30s, this meant she would spend most of the rest of her life in prison. Reporters in the courtroom noted her reaction. She placed her head in her hands as the words were read. 50 years. For Joshlyn and Larry, there would be no years left at all. After sentencing, questions lingered in the community. How had the system failed these children? Their bodies showed months of malnutrition. That meant signs were visible. Neighbors could have noticed thin arms and legs, the sluggishness of hunger, the cries that go unheard. Doctors could have recognized the decline if the children had been taken for checkups. Teachers could have spotted the changes if the children had been in school or daycare. Family could have stepped in if they had seen the warning signs. But somehow, none of these safety nets caught Joshlyn and Larry. Their decline continued in silence until death claimed them both. Their mother, Dashelle, was left grieving. She had tried to reclaim her children, but by the time she could act again, it was too late. For a parent, the loss of one child is unbearable. For Dashelle, the loss of both children, and in such a manner, is a pain beyond words. The case became not just a tragedy, but a lesson about vigilance, about the need for communities to notice and act, about the importance of systems that protect children. When people in Baltimore County talk about this case now, they remember the traffic stop, the smell in the night air, the shocking discovery of 2 small bodies in bags. They remember the autopsy waits that made them gasp, the timeline of deaths that stretched back over a year, the strange decision of an aunt to keep carrying the remains rather than seeking help. And they remember the sentence 50 years, a measure of justice, but one that will never restore what was lost. The story of Joshlyn and Larry is now part of Maryland's history, a painful reminder of what can happen when warning signs are missed, when silence becomes the easy option, when family trust is betrayed. Their short lives are honored by speaking their names, by remembering their innocence, by sharing their story so that others may be spared. It is a story that weighs heavy, but one that must be told again and again, until no child is left unseen, unheard, or unprotected. The day after the traffic stop, the neighborhood where the car had been pulled over was buzzing with whispers and cautious glances. People remembered the flashing police lights cutting through the darkness and the officers who had moved quickly but carefully around the vehicle. They remembered the long hours, the white tents that were erected, the vehicles of investigators arriving in steady procession, the solemn presence of forensic teams taking photographs, bagging evidence, and cataloguing every factor. Detail. Baltimore County Police approached the scene methodically. Every bag, every blanket, every item in Nicole's car was carefully examined. They took samples of the fluids, documented the remains of the children, and transported them to the county medical examiner. The odor that had first alerted the officer was now being recorded in official reports. It was a grim, heavy reality, the kind that haunts those who first encounter it. Detectives began their interviews almost immediately. They wanted to understand who Nicole was, how she had ended up in possession of the children, and what exactly had occurred in the months and years prior to that night. Family members were questioned. Neighbors were questioned. Friends were questioned. The answers were fragments, some clear, some contradictory. According to investigators, Nicole initially gave statements that were inconsistent in detail, but horrifyingly consistent in the deaths of Joshlyn and Larry. She admitted to the acts, explained her reasoning in detached, chilling language, and in doing so, painted a picture of neglect and concealment that was almost impossible to comprehend. As forensic investigators worked to reconstruct the timeline, they focused on the autopsies of both children. The results were stark. Joshlyn's body showed injuries consistent with blunt force trauma. There was evidence that she had been struck in May 2020, according to Nicole's statements, and that the injuries had contributed to her death. Larry's body, examined months later, showed signs of prolonged malnutrition and neglect, along with minor injuries that had gone untreated. The children's frail conditions suggested a long period of deprivation. Investigators documented the months, even years, over which the children had been suffering. Medical records, or the lack thereof, were noted. Pediatric visits that might have caught the signs had not occurred. Family oversight that could have intervened had not materialized. Every mischance, every lapse, became part of the narrative the prosecutors would later present. In addition to physical evidence, investigators reviewed Nicole's life over the years. They looked at housing records, employment history, social interactions, and any legal brushes she had experienced. It became clear that her life had been unstable in many ways. She had changed residences multiple times, held inconsistent jobs, and had financial difficulties that affected her daily living. The pattern of instability helped explain how she was able to maintain control over the children for extended periods without intervention from other adults or authorities. It was a pattern that made the months of neglect possible. The psychological aspects of the case were discussed by experts after the arrest. Child abuse experts and forensic psychologists noted that Nicole exhibited signs of detachment from empathy regarding the children's welfare. While motives in cases like these are often difficult to pinpoint with certainty, investigators suggested a combination of denial, rationalization, and fear of consequences contributed to her decision to conceal the children's deaths rather than seek help. Her statements to police, according to reports, indicated she feared being punished or losing control of her life if she reported the deaths. As the legal process advanced, the community followed the case closely. Court documents revealed that Nicole's plea in August 2024 was a strategic decision by both her legal team and the prosecutors. By pleading guilty, she avoided the uncertainty of a trial where the evidence, including photographs, autopsy reports, and the testimonies of medical experts, would be presented in full. The prosecution, in turn, secured a guaranteed conviction and a lengthy prison sentence. The plea spared the public and the family from enduring graphic courtroom proceedings, but it did not soften the blow of understanding the children's deaths. The courtroom in February 2025 was tense. Family members of the children were present, as were reporters and members of the public. When Judge Nancy M. Purpura read the sentence, there was a moment of stillness, the kind that presses in on everyone's chest. 50 years in prison. For a 33-year-old woman, 50 years meant she would likely spend the remainder of her life behind bars. Reporters noted her reaction. Hands over her face, head bowed, the weight of the sentence sinking in. The family of Joshlyn and Larry, though unable to bring the children back, could see a measure of accountability. The sentence was not mercy, it was justice measured against unimaginable loss. The aftermath for the family was profound. Nicole Johnson, the mother, had already endured the trauma of losing her children to neglect and violence. Friends and relatives offered support, but no words could fill the emptiness. Counseling and therapy became essential as family members attempted to process grief and anger. The community also wrestled with guilt and shock. How could two young children be allowed to deteriorate in their health so completely without intervention? Meetings were held, programs discussed, and child protection agencies reviewed the missed opportunities. The hope was that the tragedy might prevent future occurrences, that the deaths of Joshlyn and Larry would lead to greater awareness of child neglect and abuse. In the months after the sentence, the legacy of the case became part of local discussions. Schools and social workers used the story as a warning to stay vigilant. Law enforcement shared lessons learned about observing early warning signs. Family members of victims spoke publicly, emphasizing the importance of intervention and the responsibility of communities to notice when children are in danger. It was a story that carried pain, but also the potential for awareness and education. Nicole Johnson's life in prison became, by all reports, routine and controlled. The 50-year sentence ensured that she would be separated from society for the foreseeable future, removed from the ability to harm or neglect anyone else. For her, the reality was long-term confinement, isolation, and reflection, or at least the circumstances that forced such reflection. Meanwhile, the memory of Joshlyn and Larry was preserved by family and community members, by the media that covered the case extensively, and by the simple act of speaking their names. In telling their story, people honored their short lives and reminded themselves of the consequences when care, attention, and compassion fail. The case remains a reference point for law enforcement, child protection agencies, and families alike. It is cited in training materials, in awareness programs, and in discussions of the warning signs of neglect. The narrative is repeated not for sensationalism, but for education. Joshlyn and Larry's story illustrates the fragility of childhood, the importance of vigilance, and the devastating consequences of inaction. Though the details are horrific, the story also underscores resilience among survivors and advocates. Family members, social workers, and community leaders have worked to ensure that programs are in place to prevent similar tragedies. Awareness campaigns about malnutrition, signs of abuse, and proper reporting channels have been implemented in Baltimore County and surrounding areas. The hope is that the deaths of these two children, while tragic, will serve as a catalyst for systemic change. Even now, years after the initial discovery, people in the community recount the events with a mixture of sorrow and resolve. They remember the traffic stop, the discovery in the car, the odorous warning that alerted the officer. They remember the timeline of neglect, the medical confirmation of malnutrition, and the legal outcome. They remember the children themselves, Joshlyn with her soft smile and quiet curiosity, Larry with his laughter and small hands reaching for comfort. Their short lives became a story of tragedy, but also a story that demanded attention, reflection, and action. In the weeks leading up to the sentencing, media coverage of the case intensified. News outlets in Baltimore County and beyond reported extensively on the traffic stop, the horrific discovery, and the subsequent investigation. Local reporters described the scene with care, focusing on facts confirmed by police and court documents. They highlighted the bravery of the officer who had first smelled the decomposition, the meticulous work of the forensic team, and the painstaking process of reconstructing events that had led to the deaths of Joshlyn and Larry. The case dominated the headlines, not for sensationalism, but because it represented a stark failure of trust, oversight, and protection, a warning story for every parent, relative, and neighbor. Court transcripts revealed that the sentencing hearing was somber. Prosecutors outlined the facts, the timeline of neglect, the autopsy results, Nicole's admissions, and the prolonged suffering of the children. They described how both children had been extremely underweight, with injuries and signs of neglect that should have been noticed months before their deaths. They stressed that Nicole's decisions had directly led to the preventable deaths of her niece and nephew. According to reports, the prosecutor's voice carried throughout the courtroom as they spoke of the lost potential, the innocence destroyed, and the accountability required. The defense offered little in the way of argument. Nicole's plea of guilty left little room for mitigation beyond procedural considerations. Her attorney spoke briefly, acknowledging that the acts had been committed, expressing regret on her behalf, and requesting a sentence that balanced justice with the possibility of rehabilitation. The judge, Nancy M. Papura, listened carefully to both sides, reviewing the facts, the law, and the devastating impact on the victim's family. The sentence was pronounced with precision. Life in prison with all but 50 years suspended. The words hung in the courtroom, heavy with consequence. Family members of Joshlyn and Larry were present during the sentencing. Their faces reflected grief that had not softened over time. Tears, clenched jaws, and whispered prayers filled the courtroom. The mother, Nicole Johnson, sat with a quiet determination, listening to every word, recording every detail. Knowing that while justice could not restore her children, it could at least ensure that Nicole would never again have the opportunity to harm another child. Other relatives held each other tightly, their sorrow mingled with relief that some measure of accountability had been meted out. Community members also followed the trial closely. Baltimore County is a place where neighbors often know each other, and the shock of the case resonated widely. Schools, community centers, and local agencies held discussions about child welfare. Meetings were organized to educate people on the signs of abuse and neglect. Social workers emphasized that warning signs are not just the responsibility of officials, they are the responsibility of every adult who encounters a child in their daily life. The story of Joshlyn and Larry became a case study, a reminder that silence and inaction can have catastrophic consequences. In the months following sentencing, programs designed to prevent child abuse and neglect were strengthened. Baltimore County officials launched campaigns focused on nutrition, regular health checkups, and the importance of reporting suspected abuse. Teachers received additional training on recognizing malnutrition and behavioral changes. Pediatricians were encouraged to look beyond routine examinations to signs of prolonged neglect. While no program could undo the suffering endured by Joshlyn and Larry, these measures aimed to prevent similar tragedies from occurring in the future. Media retrospectives continued for years. Documentaries, news specials, and online articles recounted the timeline in painstaking detail. The narrative was repeated: the traffic stop, the smell of decomposition, the maggots, the suitcase and tote containing the children, the investigation, the guilty plea, and the sentencing. Each retelling served a purpose. It ensured that the children's names were remembered, that the lessons were not forgotten, and that public awareness remained high. Nicole Johnson's life in prison became a subject of limited reporting. For her, the days passed in routine confinement, under strict supervision. She was separated from society, her freedom revoked, and her future defined by the 50-year sentence. Psychologists and prison officials noted that the consequences of her actions were now inescapable, and any possibility of rehabilitation would occur entirely within the controlled environment of incarceration. She would spend decades reflecting on her choices, her failures, and the lives she had destroyed. For the Johnson family, life after the sentencing remained complicated. The mother, Joshlyn, continued her grief work, seeking counseling and support. Relatives gathered to remember Joshlyn and Larry on anniversaries and birthdays. They created small memorials, photographs, and writings that honored the children's short lives. Friends and neighbors joined in remembrance, holding quiet vigils or contributing to charitable efforts focused on child welfare. In doing so, they ensured that the children were not forgotten, that their story continued to educate, warn, and inspire action. The lessons from this case were also absorbed by law enforcement. Baltimore County Police and child protection agencies reviewed their protocols, considering how missed opportunities had contributed to the tragic outcome. They evaluated communication channels between schools, healthcare providers, and law enforcement. They examined training procedures to ensure that officers, social workers, and educators could better recognize early warning signs of severe neglect. The hope was that by learning from the mistakes in this case, future children could be protected. Public reflection on the case often returned to the small details that revealed the children's suffering. The extreme malnutrition, the injuries, the months of concealment, and a lack of intervention were cited in news articles and training materials. Experts emphasize that children are often unable to advocate for themselves. They rely on adults to see, to act, and to protect. When those adults fail, the consequences can be catastrophic, as the deaths of Joshlyn and Larry so clearly demonstrated. In telling the story of Nicole Johnson and her niece and nephew, reporters, social workers, and family members carefully balanced the need to convey the facts with the need to respect the children's memory. Every retelling emphasized that the narrative was not just about crime, punishment, or the failure of one adult, but about vigilance, care, and the responsibility that society bears toward its most vulnerable, quote, members. The children's story became a cautionary tale, a reminder that neglect is not a private matter and that silence can have deadly consequences. Even years after the events, the name Nicole Johnson is closely tied to the memory of Joshlyn and Larry in public consciousness. Yet, it is their names that are spoken most often. Their faces, described by those who knew them, remind communities of the fragility of childhood and the need for constant care. This story is retold in classrooms, by child advocacy groups, and in training sessions for law enforcement officers. Each telling is a pledge that their lives, though tragically cut short, continue to influence positive change. In the end, the case is remembered for the stark contrast between what should have been and what occurred. 2 small children, full of potential and love, were lost due to neglect and concealment. One woman's decisions set in motion a chain of events that could not be undone. Yet through remembrance, education, and systemic change, the community seeks to prevent future tragedies. Joshlyn and Larry's story, though heartbreaking, stands as a testament to the importance of vigilance, compassion, and action. Their lives, short as they were, have become a beacon of awareness, a warning, and a legacy that demands recognition and respect.
This audio was created with Podcastle.ai